Hello, everyone. There's still bickering going on between Ukraine and Russia as to whether or not Ukraine had killed the head of the Russian Black Sea Fleet when they struck Crimea. At this point, I don't really care. But to those who are saying, see, Ukraine spreads propaganda, you realize, right, that Ukraine is fighting a war and how hard it is to get information, accurate information, in the middle of war, especially when we're talking about information coming from the occupied territory. So suppose, yes, Ukraine made a mistake about this one piece of information, especially considering all of the other high-ranking military officials that did wonder in the sights of Ukrainian snipers. Okay. Compare that to Russia's now months-long myth about fighting a war against NATO on Ukrainian territory. I believe errors in information are going to happen, especially when we are talking about the state of war. So be very careful when you accuse Ukraine about spreading propaganda when it might be an honest mistake, especially considering what we're up against. Now, let's go into our summary. Ukraine's been reporting shooting down a whole bunch of Russian drones during yet another massive attack at the southern regions, including Odessa. And it wouldn't surprise me at all that that many were launched. If you look at drone attacks Ukraine had unleashed so far, unless it was something massive, like the one that they just recently did in Crimea, where there were multiple military targets. Usually you don't hear about dozens of drones being dispatched. You hear about a few. In contrast, Russia is routinely launching numerous drones, tens of them, against Ukrainian civilian targets. It's nice to hear a note of optimism from NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg. Better late than never. And once again, to remind you, what right now Ukrainian army is trying to do is drive a wedge between the eastern portion of the Russian army and the southern portion of the Russian army. If they're successful, Russian army in Crimea will be completely cut off from the rest of the Russian armed forces and from mainland Russia. Their only way to connect with Russia will be across the sea, which, as we already know, is not a comfortable place to be right now. Also, Moscow states they're going to increase their military spending by almost 70% next year. And my question is, how? How are you planning to do that? So, as we know, Russia is heavily sanctioned. Its imports are extremely restricted, as are its exports. Where are they planning to get the money to expand the military spending to meet that number? And do Russian people understand that two things are going to be very expensive? First, meeting this target is going to cost them. And next, when Russia loses this war, it's going to take decades of their children and grandchildren paying reparations to Ukraine. Putin meets with one of his Chechen underdogs. By the way, want to point out that Chechnya, Ossetia, are having some issues with their economic growth and population expansion. It's funny that any area that teams up with Russia seems to run into that particular issue. Meanwhile, Stoltenberg is visiting Kyiv, and I'm saying, Kyiv is nice and good. I mean, it's a symbolic visit, and I'm sure he will hear plenty of air raid sirens there. But if you really want to show him what's going on, take him to Zaporizhia, take him to Odessa. Also, take him to the sites of Russian atrocities like Bucha and Irpin. I want anybody from outside Ukraine to get a really, really good look at what has been done to Ukraine and its people. Jens Stoltenberg was joined by French and British defense officials, French defense minister and British defense secretary. And yeah, again, I'm glad that they're paying attention. I'm glad that they're coming to Ukraine instead of just waiting for Zelensky to show up, in their capitals and their countries far away from the fire. But it would be really nice if they could get a closer look at what is actually happening on the ground.